Hey gang, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. This is the show where I interview major thought leaders to show how worldview changes everything. In today's episode, my guest is Steve Greisen. He is an award-winning filmmaker whose story is incredible. He grew up overseas with his parents having a broadcasting company that broadcast Christian messages into communist China. He came back to the United States, went into the Jesus movement, became an award-winning filmmaker, as I mentioned. Listen, there are so many things we're going to be talking about, but he's also going to give us some specific insight into how you can better tell your story and see your calling as part of what God is doing in the world. Steve Greisen, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show.
Thanks, Jeff.
You are here in person. This is the first time we've had an in-studio guest on the Dr. Jeff Show and on 20-some episodes that we've done so far. So welcome.
I'm glad to be a rule breaker. That's good. That's the story of my life, by the way.
We have so much to talk about in this. You're a filmmaker, Exploration Films.
Right.
People will want to check that out. They can even get a membership there and look at all the documentary films that you have available.
Yep.
And you're constantly making new films. And one of them we're going to talk about here in a little bit, which is really amazing. Stephanie and I watched it the other night, and both of us were thinking, this brings theology and end times and everything all together in a whole new creative way. So I'm really excited to talk about that. But first, we just have to get to know you a little bit. You have one of the craziest backstories of anybody that I have known, because you were part of the Jesus movement.
Right.
So our younger viewers and listeners may not even know what that is. So you're going to have to start from scratch.
Well, and jumping back up just a little further, I was a missionary kid. I was raised in Hong Kong from the time I was 6 years old through high school. So the Jesus movement actually made it there. But those years, my parents Mao was in power.
Yeah. Wow.
He was doing the nasty things that communists do. By some counts, he killed 70 million of his own people. He was... Communist idea was funded by the Russians, and he grew food, and he gave too much food away and starved 30 million one time.
Wow.
And so during those years, my parents built a thing called China Radio. It was a broadcast transmitter that was larger than Voice of America to go into China. And back then, you couldn't read any books except Mao's little red book. And so the only safe way was they all had radios, and in the privacy of your home, your bed on the head on the pillow, you could listen to a broadcast.
You could listen.
And so they did that forever, and that's where I grew up, and that was phenomenal. My mom did an English show where they used all these different ways to preach the gospel. Some were kid shows, music shows, all kinds of stuff. She got 10,000 letters a month coming out of China from her show. So it's just a remarkable time. That's how I grew up. I grew up around people doing extraordinary things, and it was normal in my world.
And using media to communicate the gospel.
Exactly. So I come back after I become a senior in high school, and I come back to the U.S. to figure out what next steps are. And it's the Jesus movement is underway in full force. I'm a young musician, so I have a band up in Bellevue, Washington. I worked for the Nordstrom family. And it was an amazing time, because that period of time, it's like there was this hunger in the culture that I've never seen since. There was, the Jesus movement was interesting because the builders came back home, the 50s guys, after World War II, and built the Great Society, right? And came home and commanded their families because they were military guys, right? But a lot of their kids said, we don't think it's about the white picket fence and, all that stuff. And they began to search. And there was a genuine haunting search in the culture. And if you listen to 60s music, listen to Dylan, go down the list, it's reflected in the music of the time. They were so lost in a lot of ways, but there was an integrity and a sincerity to that search that was there.
They knew they were lost.
They knew they were lost.
But they were willing to be honest about the search that they were.
That's right. And so even the drug use that we're, famously remember, there was some partying, of course, that went on, but there was also this existential, expansionistic, trying to LSD, the search for God, all that stuff, the Timothy Leary stuff that wasn't rooted in anything, and so it couldn't deliver anything.
Right.
but more hopelessness. But these kids, began to live in their vehicles on the beach. They started living in tents. They rejected the materialism of their parents, and they said, "There's got to be more to life than this."
Yeah.
And that was a cry of the heart. So when the gospel came in, that taught love, peace, joy, and forgiveness and meaning in life, the gospel spoke to them in a way that was perfect for that time.
Yeah.
Now, we know the gospel applies today, but every time in history, the culture is a little different. We're a little more anarchistic today, a little more whatever, right?
Yeah.
But at that time in history, and these kids started coming to Christ, and they came by the thousands. And so I was doing music. I had a group, a band, and we got contracted originally when I lived in Europe. I went to school in Switzerland, and we got contracted by the U.S. military because we had 400,000 guys in Germany back then holding back the Russians.
Right.
Big moment.
Yeah.
And so we were all believers, sharing our faith, playing guitars and singing, and they didn't care. They said, "Do whatever you want," and they did amazing. I mean, we just had an amazing time. They would do things like throw us in a van and blindfold us and take us to a secret location, and then the van would open up and we'd step out, and there would be an ICBM missile, a giant missile pointed at the Soviet Union, and 90 guys sitting around with that missile, manning it, waiting for a command for it to launch, basically bored out of their mind for 2 weeks at a time.
Yeah.
So we'd go play. We'd play cards with them. We'd lunch with them, spend part of the day with them. And there was just so many great opportunities, large and small, with the military. Then we came back to the U.S. and started recruiting kids into missions.
Okay.
And started playing, again, using music. And then that's where I met my wife, who was young and also a young musician like I was. And they were a group called the Second Chapter of Acts. And so then we started doing more in the U.S. and it went on and on and on.
It's Nellie and her two siblings.
That's right.
I remember as a young Christian,
Yeah.
somebody gave me some records. They said, "There's Christian music."
Yeah.
This is in the 1980s.
Yeah.
There's Christian music.
Well, that was late 1980.
I know. So I think
1973, man.
I got Amy Grant's Second Chapter of
Sure.
Acts.
Okay.
Quite a few others. But Keith Green was one of the records that somebody gave to me.
Yeah, all those guys were. It was an amazing time. Everything that happens comes out of a context, right? So, not understanding the context, sometimes you miss the importance of it. So, the thing back then was my brother-in-law was an audio engineer.
Okay.
So he had come to the Lord through his drug dealer, had led him to Christ.
Oh my goodness.
And he was. My brother-in-law was recording Frank Zappa and all these different secular artists in Hollywood. And so when the Axe family had this big tragedy where they lost both their mom and dad 2 years apart, Nellie, my wife, was number 8 of 9, and Matthew, her brother, was number 9. So they were young. They were 12 and 14 at that time, and they had no place to live. So they scattered them into the homes of the young married. So Annie, her sister, was just 24. Young married, and has these two come in to live with them. But it was that tragedy and that pressure which created this moment for God to do something redemptive. Yeah. And they learned they could sing together really well. And that the rest was history. We did our first record. Our first record had, which was called With Footnotes for Second Chapter, had the first group of studio musicians ever used on a Christian recording. They had a hit in Southern California, a secular hit. Yeah. And there were no Christian labels back then. There was no Christian radio. So Pat Boone arranged a deal with MGM Records, but they quickly learned that this doesn't really fit because you guys are talking about Jesus. And the way these guys are promoting albums is they're handing a bag of Coke to the program director at a station and say, "Play our new record." So it was an interesting time, but God was doing extraordinary things. I think we ended up playing to maybe 4 million people live.
Wow.
Massive. Yeah.
Wow. And then people have an opportunity to come to Christ even through the concert as well. Yeah. So these are like evangelistic crusades.
Everything. So it's a combination of young people finding music that reflected their culture. So we were all doing music that was we were influenced by, so we were creating music that was influenced by the Beatles and all the artists of the day. There was nothing like that. So all these young Christians are going, "Oh my gosh, there's music that reflects our taste and our love, that sounds like what we're used to hearing.
Yeah.
So they would come out, and we never played in churches. We just played in civic auditoriums and arenas.
Okay.
And these kids would come out by the thousands, and they're going, I go to a Lutheran church, I go to a Methodist church, ones that were believers.
Yeah.
But we don't get any of this in our church, but we come here, and we feel like we're around all of our friends. We feel like we're one unified group of people hanging out and praising Jesus together every time you guys come to our town once a year.
Yeah.
So it's just such a cool time, and people would come to the Lord, and we trained our band guys to pray with people and to spend time afterwards. And I mean, it's hard to describe that time. It's kind of like being in a foxhole when you meet those old guys that fought in World War II.
Yeah.
They do their best, but you know, it's hard to describe.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking now, I know that there are people who are watching or listening right now thinking, how could something like that be reclaimed in our own day? You think there's any hope for that?
Well, I think God always does something new. I think Jack Hayford called the Jesus movement a holy explosion. It didn't belong to the church. In fact, the church didn't want anything to do with it because everybody, the young people had long hair and they didn't wear shoes. And back then, you just didn't look like a Christian to them. They didn't want you to come in, So there were very few churches that would let these young people who are finding Christ come in. But people like Jack Hayford and Chuck Smith and Pat Boone. Pat had a house in Beverly Hills, and he said, "But you guys can do baptisms in my pool. I think Jesus is working here. So use the pool. You could baptize kids there." And so I think, but in looking, there was also things that came out of the Jesus movement that were messy. I think people look back and they sort of romanticize the time, and there's a lot to be thankful for.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of crazy stuff that happened. When you have thousands of young people kind of walking around, some get grounded and some don't, and other things that pop up. But now I think we're at a time where I know that God is interested in redeeming culture, and I know He's interested in using very young people to do it. I think we tend to look and say, you got to have all this training and you got to do this and this and this. And none of that was a factor back then. Yeah. It was just, I once was blind and now I see. And that was the gospel.
And the gospel was communicated by Jesus' original disciples, who were probably very young, maybe even teenagers.
Yes.
And didn't know what they were doing.
Right.
So there's a sense in which if you don't know what you're doing, you don't really know if you have failed.
Right.
So you're willing to take more chances.
That's true. And, I think that's so true. I think people rise to the level of expectation. I was around YWAM in those early days with YWAM too. And, those guys, they'd go, well, I feel God's calling me to the Middle East. It's like, well, we don't have anyone there, so you're the Middle East director, right? And it's amazing how those guys, so many of them, accomplished so much.
Yeah.
I saw that in my own grandfathers. They were remarkable men. My one grandfather built the hospital in India that Mother Teresa died in. And they just did, he built the largest Bible school in Europe. He had an 8th grade education. He just felt God was calling him to do stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm always fascinated by, in a business, but I'm also a ministry guy, and I'm always fascinated by these beginnings. Somebody starts something.
Yeah.
And that moment of actually trying, you have no promise of what it's going to look like.
That's right.
Nothing. But the guy has the faith to say, I'm going to start something. And then a lot of times those things become amazing.
Yeah.
And there's something magical in that little moment, I think.
Wow.
That
reminds me of Zechariah 4:10. Do not despise the day of small beginnings, for the Lord loves to see the work begin.
Can't tell you how many times I've quoted that.
He's a starter.
He is an entrepreneur, absolutely.
Yeah. We've got to talk about this because you mentioned this and it kind of flew by real quick.
Yeah.
That what you're seeing right now is the gospel in culture.
Yeah.
That transforming culture, being involved in culture. But you got to unpack that for us.
Well, I think the gospel is the gospel. It's never changed. Communication skill, it changes, like how we do things. For my parents, it was radio, right? And when we were young people, it was playing music, and there's so many ways that we use. But I think for the thing about the music days and now in the film days is we're affecting people with big ideas, and you're doing it in story. And it was true in music. So back then, music wasn't sort of worship style music that they have now. It was commentary. It was stories. It was, and those things illustrated God's or a Christian worldview in terms of how we talked about things. And it's the same in film now. For me, I look at film like we're doing the same thing Jesus did. Jesus told parables. The shortest parable he ever told was the parable of the worker. It was just a couple of verses, right? And you had these two workers, and they both worked the same amount of time. One worked all day, one worked a short part of the day. They agreed on the same rate. The guy that worked all day complained because the guy that worked a few hours got the same pay. And he's like, hey, that's what we negotiated. Well, it's interesting. At the end of that parable, Jesus doesn't say, now I want you to invite me into your heart. He just sort of drops the mic and says, for whom who has ears, let him hear. And sort of that is the way it is with story. Story doesn't speak to everyone. Some stories will speak to some people. Yeah. Some songs will speak to some people. But that's the way that Jesus used to communicate his big ideas. And I think film and music, both those are two of the most powerful ways to do it.
There's something huge in what you're saying, because a lot of Christian efforts, and good ones. We have a huge library of books that we offer to our students at Summit Ministries. Some of them are commentaries. They seek to be exhaustive in covering every topic. You can look in the index and the table of contents, and you can find your answer. But in a story, you're inviting somebody into something else, whether it's in song or in film.
Absolutely. It's so powerful. It's great to be educated. There's no question about that. It's important. But, to let the life of Jesus work in you, to see the work of the Holy Spirit in your life and feel called to do something, to use your gifts. Everybody's been given gifts. Everybody's been given gifts. It could be academic. It could be other things, all kinds of business skills. It could be convincing people, being a communicator, whatever it is, that you would use your gift to let Jesus touch the world through you.
Good word.
And I just think that's what he's called us to. He's called us to be his. And then when we're his, we end up in the place that he puts us. And so we got to know whether, I grew up a missionary guy. Look, our family was paraded up on stage, dressed in our little Chinese clothes, and we sang songs, and my dad preached, and we talked, and we were honored and blessed because we'd gone all the way over to a long ways away that most people have never gone. Yeah. And at the same time, back in the early days, the business guy would be sitting in the pew, and he wasn't getting honored. He wasn't getting blessed. He wasn't told that what he is doing is a gift from God.
Right.
But when they needed his money, all of a sudden everything changed. And so I think that was a great sin of the church back then, right? Yeah. And now we moved past that, and we realize that there's many parts to this body as Christians, right? Yeah. And God's made so many different people with different skills, and we can all give those skills back and offer them up as worship to God and find our place in society.
I'll tell you, that's a theme of this show. I think that I hadn't really put my finger on until just now, is that we want people to realize whether you're an artist, you could be a filmmaker, you could be a scientist. We had a biochemist on. We had an astronomer on the show. Cool. All these different people, and some business people as well. But make that case for a minute, because I think a lot of people, obviously they want to make a living. Obviously they want to earn enough money that they can have a good means of provision for their family, take care of their kids. But make the case for a biblical worldview of business before we start talking about films, because I have so many questions.
Well, it's interesting. The Pilgrims believed that if you had a business, a skill, and you didn't make money, it was a sin. Interesting point of view, right?
Yeah.
But the point is, God's given you something, right? And God's given you a talent. And so that whole parable of don't bury your talent, right? The guy was scared, and so he didn't do anything with it. He was scared that he might lose it, and so he buried it. The point of that parable was Jesus wants us to use measured risk.
Yeah.
Jesus is interested in sowing and reaping, multiplying what we've been given. Right. So he's given us all these gifts. The question is, how do we serve our fellow man with those gifts, and how do we serve him? And those two things are in concert. What was interesting about Martin Luther, if you look back at his story, he said, well, it doesn't matter if you're a preacher like me or a cobbler. We're all presenting our work to God. And if we're going to present our work to God, then it follows that it better be good if this is our offering, right? We can't give God junk, right? Yeah. And so because of that big idea, look what happened in Northern Europe that he influenced. All of a sudden, the prosperity grew. Right. Southern Europe, that remained under the old ideas of the Catholics at that time, remained impoverished. So these ideas that God's given us something, and business is an important one, because when you look at what business provides, the whole idea of capital, growing capital, you employ people, you serve people, you create revenue. That every time you buy something from somebody, there's a whole chain of people that are getting a piece. Yeah. So I grew up in the shadow of Mao's communist China, and it was a Marxist idea of this utopian, beautiful idea, but it never works out that way. I mean, there are so many people that die under that system. The very elite become very successful. The people themselves become crushed. There's no room for people's dreams. There's no freedom to do those things. And, the Chinese are very industrious people. I mean, give them 2 weeks and a little freedom and they will produce stuff. They're hardworking. Yeah. And so really what you've seen in China is this sort of a switch to capitalism, but still controlled by these communist thugs. Right. That's what they are. Right. They're still in charge. They got all the power and the guns and so forth. But
what we have here in the States is the freedom to start a business, to be an entrepreneur, to take a risk, and see whether that risk will pay off. Yep. There may be 300 kinds of cereal on the shelf at the store, but you might have the best one, and you should be able to go to the store and make your case for having space.
Well, but I think that's also the blessing of this big idea that you just described, is we do have a lot of options as a result. We have 300 choices of cereal, right? Which is cool. Yeah. And there's always somebody out there saying, I can do it better. Yeah. And I love that, and things change, people always, and I look at news and how things are characterized in media. They all act like people are in the same station in life their whole life. These people are poor, and these people are rich, and these people are whatever, They're dividers by style. But, nobody's at this. Look, I was a young guy. I didn't have 2 pennies to rub together. When I started my company, I didn't have $1 from somebody else, and I didn't have much of my own at all. I maybe had $4,000 that I'd accumulated to start it. And I just began working, and I worked like a dog because I was passionate about what we were doing, So 12-hour days were normal for me. Yeah. But I love that idea that, we could grow. And we had this theory. I did the opposite of what I'd seen so many others do with other people's money. Because when you're spending your own money, you're a lot more careful, right? Right. So we had this theory of let's grow slow. Instead of let's grow fast, which means you throw a bunch of other people's money at it and see how quickly you can gain market share. Yeah. Let's grow slow, because in our business, it was about getting better at what we did. Yeah. We started out, we weren't very good, like most people that are in our business, right? Yeah. And it takes a while to get better and better. And I said, every year, if we could be 10 or 15% better, and then it gets harder after that. It gets down to 1%, 2% better.
Sure, super hard, But but if you're doing something you're passionate about, what Martin Luther called vocation, which comes from the Latin word vocare, to call, which is when Scripture talks about calling in the New Testament, that's the Latin word that's being used to translate what was written out. That's cool in Greek. So everybody's got a call, and it's not just pastors and missionaries. It's everybody. I want to go back to exploration films a little bit and talk about story. I hope that's not too abrupt of a transition. I kind of led you down the line of because I'm talking about business because I'm passionate. I think everybody should start a business.
That's a great idea.
You learn to serve when you have to serve in order to survive.
That's exactly right. The way I say it is, you serve somebody else's need or die.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons we never started as a nonprofit idea, we're doing the same thing. We're probably taking less of a salary than a lot of nonprofit guys. Who knows?
Sure.
Not to be over cynical about that, but we're all doing the same stuff. But I just thought, I love business because it's very exacting. It is, you have to meet somebody's need, or you're not going to be there tomorrow. And when we started, we had a lot of nonprofits as our clients, and I noticed fairly quickly they were under a different set of rules than we were. Oh. So they would say, "We really want to get we were doing like client work at this point. We want to get a video out about our story and our whatever we're doing," and great, and we'd talk about it. And then when it was done, they had no strategy for how they were going to implement this tool that has now been built. Or they overspend, and they've gotten a pinch. They sent out a fundraising letter and solved the problem. We could never do that.
Right.
We were under a different set of rules. But in the long run, those rules were very important to learn. Taught us a lot.
Now, the specific success that you've had in exploration films is that you've become a master, and your team, they're masterful at this, at telling stories, specifically a lot of them through documentary style.
That's right. I started out and I love documentaries because being raised in Hong Kong and seeing real life in many cases, which was way more interesting than Hollywood could ever write, then that's why I knew so many amazing stories. And so, documentaries for me were fascinating. I loved real life. The first one we did was on the discovery of the location of Mount Sinai. It was a film on that, which got worldwide attention literally overnight. Next thing you know, we're giving presentation to the heads of Disney. We've got 1,100 newspaper stories with UPI. Vanity Fair does 8 pages with pictures. Delta Airlines, Dateline, NBC. Just goes on and on and on. Right. And we're living in Monument, Colorado. It's kind of heady times. Before that, of course, we did 10,000 hours of client work.
Exactly.
We did it. Right. I could show you the pictures.
You worked for 10,000 hours to become an overnight success.
Exactly.
Right?
But, that was fun. That was our first documentary. Then I, got involved in doing a bunch of animal documentaries. And I loved animals. Growing up, I had pet monkeys and, third world kid. So I had a different life. But, animals to me were such they tell such a story of God's design. And I thought everybody loves them. So this is an easy door in to look at what God has created. And we ended up doing a whole series on animal designs and had a big impact on the very first state that said, let's look at alternate theories to make available in high school, not just evolution, was Kansas. And so they asked that we would send them all that we had done on that stuff. And then they had smart guys, PhDs, come in and talk and give a presentation. And they were the first state that said, we'll allow some alternate theories to also be taught.
So intelligent
design. It's a theory. Intelligent design, in some cases creation. Here are the different ideas. So now I think there's 40 states that are allowing that. It's all sort of, who knows, a show would have that impact on culture.
How did it have that? I mean, it's not just the idea of it. There are a lot of people who've done videos about creation. A lot of people have done videos about animals. But how? Tell me
the story.
What's the secret sauce? A little bit. No, how did you create something that people all across the country even want to show in schools?
Well, I think so our approach is that we wouldn't publish this, but internally we would say it. We're dealing with great truths for small minds. Okay. And we qualify ourselves as the small minds. And so we said, whatever we do, we can't be the smart guys. We need to reach Bubba. I lived in East Texas for 12 years. If Bubba gets it, then we found a doorway into more people. Okay. And so that became sort of how we wrote. The other thing was we didn't want to tell people what to believe. We wanted to take them on a journey where it unfolds and they would come to their own conclusion. It'd be an obvious conclusion, but it would be conclusion. And so, all of a sudden, we do a deal with Netflix. We get 425,000 star reviews. We just kept going. It just seemed like everything we did continued to be remarkably successful. And we weren't that smart. People say, well, how did you figure this out? And I'm saying, to me, this is part of the faith journey that I learned way back when I was young. All I'm doing is taking one step in front of the other and presenting my work to God and saying, let's do our best here. and God does what he does. And, honestly, we ended up, we did a whole bunch of stuff. We did a thing with the symphony in Denver. We got nominated for a Grammy for Best Music Film.
Yeah. Colorado Symphony.
Yeah, Portraits of Colorado was the name of the film. And it just went on and on and on. The archaeological stuff we did, Archaeology Today said it was, when we did the Sinai story, it was the greatest find since the Dead Sea Scrolls, is what they said. And I mean, and it confirmed the Bible, because that one was a piece where people said, hey, does the Bible really have veracity? Is it true? And it really showed things that the Bible talks about. And so we kept finding not only the stuff we produced, but over time we started working with other filmmakers as well. So they said, hey, we're seeing your stuff everywhere. Who are you guys? And will you help us get our stuff out?
Yeah.
So now we work with filmmakers from the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, South Africa, England, and it goes on and on and on, New Zealand.
Yeah.
And our thing is to say, let's be in the conversation, because we put these films out where everybody watches films. So it's Amazon and iTunes, and in some cases Netflix. They've changed their model a little bit. But all of these platforms that and a bunch you don't know, and they're springing up all around the world, in South America and Africa, all over. So we're doing deals with all these people to get this catalog of films that we built out. And many times they're being translated and so on. And it's just amazing. During the pandemic, for example, we thought, what's going to happen to us? Like everybody did, right? What's going to happen? We, especially in March, we ended up having over 1 million minutes a day of our content streamed online, because everybody's stuck at home. Right? And we're thinking,
watching.
Hidden blessing. Who would have thought, right?
Yeah. One thing I love about the films that I've seen from you, and I know I haven't seen them all, but occasionally, back when we had DVDs, you sent me some DVDs.
Oh, yeah, those are fun.
And now we stream them, because Stephanie and I will, 9 times out of 10, if we have a choice between watching a Hollywood movie or a documentary, we'll choose the documentary.
Oh, you like them too? Good.
But I have a question for you. One thing I've noticed about them is you build suspense at the beginning of the movie. Mm-hmm. In other words, a documentary is not just A happened, then B happened, then C happened, then D happened. It's not linear.
No.
There's a flow to it. Is that too much of a trade secret to ask?
Not necessarily. I think the storytelling model is just, there's a bunch of different ways you can tell a story. And I'm enough of a guy with ADD that I got to keep myself entertained, right? And American media has taught us to don't drag out, don't sit and talk to me for 2 minutes. I can't handle it, right? This is the world we are now in. So we're competing for the eyes and ears of people that have been trained. This is the way they watch. So when I do stuff, like for instance, I did a show called The Master Designer, the song. It was all about animals and so on. But our storytelling model, I had this idea. Why don't we look for animals that had an impact on a country or a culture at a certain time.
Oh, interesting.
So, and then we'll use that as the setup to introduce the animal, and then we'll go into the animal. So, for instance, we did one on the bees, and we call it The Bees That Saved America, because there's this story where George Washington is fighting the redcoats. Mm-hmm. He knows that they're coming. He doesn't have the intelligence he needs. And he sends one of his men to find the intelligence, and he's attacked along the way. He's laying by the side of the road. He's bleeding, and this little girl comes up, who's probably 14 or 15, and he says, "Take this to General Washington." And she jumps on his horse and takes off. And right behind her are the redcoats. Well, she knows this area, and she knows where these hives are along the way. She takes a stick, and she beats these hives as she's flying past them all. And they all get stung and slowed down. And when she gets to George Washington with the intelligence, he says, "Young lady, today you'll be remembered. You and your bees will be remembered." And he says, and he referred to the cackling geese of Rome when the Gauls were attacking Rome. Yeah. They're scaling the walls of Rome, and the geese alerted them, and they saved the city. Well, Washington refers to that, He says it's cackling geese that saved Rome, but it's the bees that saved America. Wow. And that's our setup into the whole bees.
I love it.
And then the bees are fascinating because most people know a lot of smart things about bees, but they don't know the stuff we told, because there's so much to tell.
Yeah.
So
that's got to apply to all kinds of areas of life.
True.
If you're giving a speech, you're asking, you've been asked to give a Sunday school lesson or whatever it is. that you're creating that fascination,
Right.
giving them some information they wouldn't have been able to know, and then revealing the
Yes.
topic.
And I think people generally love to learn, but they want to be held. Their attention needs to be held. So a lot of times I'll look at a story and I'll look at it like in, say, three elements to that story. So we may be over here on one element of the story, one part of the journey. Here would be another one that we'd go into. Here would be another one, and we come in and out of those elements. For instance, a guy called me up. He'd seen one of our films, and he said, "Hey, man, I just became a Christian. I salvaged the Titanic." And I said, "You did what?" He said, "I salvaged the Titanic." He said, "I formed a public company. We had the 4 mini subs in the world that could dive 12,600 feet down. We pulled 7,000 artifacts out of the Titanic, and I started this museum called the Titanic Experience." Yeah. Well, he said, "I went into a bookstore. I'm trying to learn about Christ. So much stuff's boring. Your stuff's kind of manly. I loved it." And so we started talking about a film where he would go back and we would go back to Titanic. Right. So looking at those layers that I talked about, one of them would be this guy would go back, sailing back, the guy that salvaged the Titanic on his way back. Yeah. So that's one part of the journey. Mm-hmm. Second part of the journey were the people that were on the Titanic who loved Jesus. There were some amazing stories there. Yeah. And so, there was a third element. I can't remember what it was at the time, but it was, the name of the piece would have been Finding Faith at Titanic. Yeah. Well, this is how he found faith, because he almost died in the middle of that, and that's what led him to Christ. But, you look for those layers when you're telling a story to take people in. I think writers do the same thing in books. It's very the same, essentially. Yeah. We have to get to it quicker. We have to use less words. We've got an hour, Right. Think about that, right? Yeah. So it gives us a chance to be punchy. And a lot of times, we'll overshoot 20-1 in terms of footage. And then we'll sit there and go, we got to throw out 22 minutes here. And we love those 22 minutes, but they got to go. Yeah,
because they don't directly relate. Now,
they do it, it's too long. People just don't want to wait.
Attention span. Yeah. When I publish a book, the publisher asks me for 50 or 60,000 words. Don't send me the manuscript until you have 50 or 60,000 words. That's right. Hone it down. But for you, and in every film, I think if anybody were to actually read a script of that's in existence when the movie is being made, they're going to be amazed how few words
there are. Very small. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you've written books up in my mountain place. That's been a lot of fun, man, to get you. Yeah, because that's a remote place up in the mountains. It's gorgeous.
It's been a great spot. I have had a lot of good writing up there. In fact, two books and then a start on a third. Yeah. That at least were your place was part of.
I find that hilarious, and I'm not a reader. That's why I'm doing movies. People go, "Hey, Jeff mentions thanks you in his book somewhere," and I go, "Really?" That's all I know about your book.
I sent you a copy. I know. I underlined it.
I have bookshelves full of books that I find very interesting, but I figured one day when I'm old and in a old folks home, I'll start reading. I'll need some things to do. In the meantime, I'm busy. Oh, man. Yeah, I'm just...
See how this is? See, I watch his movies.
I know. It's hardly fair. But I'm ADD, I'm ADD enough to say, I look at a book, and this is literally what goes on. And I know this is a violation to smart guys like you, right? And I hang out with John Stone Street a lot. They're just aghast at all this. Yeah. But I look at a book and I go, oh man, the whole world's going by out there, and I'm sitting looking at these pages. That's the way my brain works.
That's so funny.
God did that.
Mine is, I want to look at these pages because there's a whole world going on out there.
That's a good, good alternate point.
Excellent. I want to talk about one of the films, a recent one that you did. Stephanie and I just saw it. I don't know when this came out, Before the Wrath.
So Before the Wrath is one of our distributed films with this filmmaker that we work with. Yeah. So he's got an interesting story. He was working for MTV, not a Christian, and he was a block from the towers in New York when the towers went down. Wow. And that had such an impact on him. That led him to faith in Christ, and it shifted his whole thing. So Before the Wrath, we think of us as a record label. We released that to the world.
Got it.
All right?
Yeah.
So that came out in 2020. Mm-hmm. And that thing is just... it was for 3 months. It was the #1 documentary on Amazon.
Wow.
It was the number 5 it's not documented, 5 by all films on Amazon. We did a nationwide theatrical release in South Korea in the middle of COVID. And the second wave was coming into South Korea. They said, this film is the best reviewed film during this time slot. We want to release it again when this COVID thing goes away because it hindered us, you know? So they're waiting for a time to do that again. It's had over 30,000 reviews out there on all these different platforms. But it's a phenomenal way of telling an important story. Yeah. And it's got an aggressive title, Before the Wrath.
Before the Wrath,
which is, it's about the return of Christ, right?
Right. It's about how, if you understand Galilean history and tradition in which Jesus was speaking, then you realize Christ has to come back. Right. That his return is going to happen because it flows along with a whole, well, we won't get into too much, but a tradition that every Galilean would have been familiar with. Yeah. It's going to change everything. It especially will change for me how I take communion. And the reason why, you're just going to have to watch the film to see why that would be the case. Yeah,
well, if they go to Exploration Films, they could see the film. You know, I think the thing about that movie that's very interesting is, as you referred to, Jesus is saying these things at the Last Supper, and he's speaking to his disciples who are all Galileans, every one of them. And so the words that he's using, when you understood what they are hearing, remember we talked about it's, you know, the context that you're in, right? When you get what they heard, and the pictures they knew from being a Galilean with their wedding and the other things that go on, it's quite revolutionary. And it's interesting because it does emphasize that Jesus is returning. And I think about the Jesus movement, that was one major theme was Maranatha. Christ is returning. And it was the idea of, we thought he'd returned like, you know, a while ago. We didn't know the timetable. But, you know, that's the truth. He is returning. And so it gives a certain way that it changes the way you live when you live in the light of that truth. Because you don't know what's going to happen in your lifetime, or, you know, he's having mercy on the world. So more can come to know him. Who knows what his strategy is, but he's returning. There's no doubt.
And we've got to be ready. That we live, we invest, we build businesses, ministries, all of these kinds of things as if they're going to last a very long time. But at the same time, we're living as if Christ's return is imminent. That gives us that sense of urgency while we're doing the long term.
I agree. I think, you know, people have to realize that each one of us are part of God's family and then his body, right? That's the way the Bible describes it. And so some may say, well, I only do this, or Jeff's cool, he writes books, or Steve's great, he does movies, whatever. They should never look at it that way, because we're all his. And so it doesn't matter. The smallest thing, well, you know, God views them all as very important in his kingdom, in his providence. So the thing we have to understand is be who God made you. Give what God gave you. And each one of us, when we all do that together, we'll transform our culture. God is interested in transforming people all around us. He's not interested as much. Our politics are important. I grew up on the doorstep of Mao. I understand what it means to not have a vote and why we need to fight for that in America. But that pales in comparison for what God's really calling us is to be into his family and to be his children. So we know him and live out the purpose he's designed for us.
I can't think of a better way to end the show. I mean, we've been friends for a long time, Steve, but some of these things we talked about today, we haven't ever talked about, the two of us before.
That's true. It's been
absolutely
wonderful.
Fascinating. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure, Jeff. Always fun.
So glad to have you joining in the conversation on the Dr. Jeff Show today. You can find out more information about Steve Greisen and the films that he's made and take a look at them at explorationfilms.com. You might also want to check out the Exploration Films podcast, where Steve interviews people who are filmmakers, getting into the backstory of what makes the storytelling that they're doing so incredibly powerful. We'll see you next time.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Dobson from the Rebel Parenting Podcast. When my parents, Jim and Shirley Dobson, sent me to the Summit Ministries Worldview Conference when I was 17, we had no idea the impact it would have on my life. It changed me so much in 2 short weeks, I've returned every summer for 34 years. This summer, your student can attend an in-person conference. That's right, in person. Summit Ministries Worldview Conference challenges students ages 16 to 24 to think deeper about their convictions and their faith by engaging with today's top worldview thinkers and apologists. Can you imagine in person with other students learning about the Christian worldview? If not, they can attend Summit's virtual experience, and it's amazing. Change your student's life forever by partnering with Summit Ministries Worldview Conference today. Find out more by clicking the link in the show notes.